Welcome to another gentle journey with Sleepy Philosophy, where we explore life's deepest questions at a pace perfect for drifting minds and quiet contemplation. Tonight, we're venturing into one of philosophy's most famous thought experiments, a simple scenario that has puzzled ethicists, challenged moral frameworks, and sparked countless debates for over half a century. But don't worry, we won't be racing through complex arguments or wrestling with academic jargon. This is a slow, thoughtful exploration designed to settle your mind while quietly expanding it. Before we begin our philosophical wandering, if you find these gentle explorations helpful for sleep or simply enjoy pondering life's big questions in a peaceful setting, a quiet like would mean the world. It helps other contemplative souls find their way to this cozy corner of YouTube. And if you'd like to join me for more sleepy philosophical adventures, that subscribe button is always there, patiently waiting. I'm curious too, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment if you're feeling chatty before the drowsiness sets in. Whether it's past midnight in Mumbai or the early hours in Edinburgh, you're wonderfully welcome here. Now, I'll do my best to keep things soothing rather than overstimulating, but if you find yourself lying awake, pondering moral dilemmas and ethical frameworks, well, at least you'll have some fascinating philosophical territory to explore while the Sandman takes his time. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to encounter a question that might seem simple at first glance, but opens into depths that philosophers are still navigating today. Picture this. You're standing beside a railway track on a quiet afternoon. The sun is warm on your shoulders, birds are chirping somewhere in the distance, and there's that particular stillness that comes just before something significant happens. Ahead of you, the tracks stretch into the distance, gleaming in the sunlight like two silver ribbons laid across the landscape. It's peaceful, ordinary even. But then you notice something that changes everything. A runaway trolley is hurtling down the track toward 5 railway workers who are completely absorbed in their tasks, unaware of the approaching danger. They're too far away to hear your shouts, too focused on their work to notice the growing rumble of the approaching trolley. In just moments, unless something changes, 5 lives will be lost in what seems like a tragic but unavoidable accident. But wait, you notice something else. Just beside where you're standing is a lever, a simple railway switch that could divert the trolley onto a side track. Your hand hovers over it as you quickly assess the situation. Yes, pulling this lever would save those 5 workers. The trolley would veer safely away from them onto the alternate track. Problem solved, lives saved, crisis averted. Except there's a complication. On that side track, there's another worker. Just one person, also absorbed in their task, equally unaware of any danger. If you pull the lever, you'll save 5 lives, but you'll also cause the death of 1. If you don't pull the lever, 5 people will die, but you won't be directly responsible for anyone's death. You'll simply have failed to act. Your hand remains poised over the lever. Time seems to slow as this impossible choice crystallizes before you. 5 lives or 1, action or inaction, intervening to save the many while causing harm to the few, or stepping back and allowing events to unfold as they will. This scenario, first introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot in the 1960s and later developed by Judith Jarvis Thomson, is known as the trolley problem. It's become one of the most discussed thought experiments in moral philosophy, not because it represents a situation you're likely to encounter in real life, but because it illuminates something fundamental about how we think about right and wrong, about the difference between killing and letting die, about the weight of our actions versus our inactions. What makes this dilemma so enduringly fascinating is how it splits people almost down the middle. When presented with this scenario, most people, somewhere around 80 to 90%, say they would pull the lever. The mathematics seems clear enough. 5 lives are worth more than 1 life. The utilitarian calculation is straightforward. Minimize harm, maximize good, save the greater number. It feels obvious, even if it also feels terrible. But here's where it gets interesting, where the comfortable certainty begins to crack around the edges. Let's modify the scenario slightly and see how you feel about this version. You're standing on a bridge overlooking the same railway track. Below you, that same runaway trolley is racing toward the same 5 unsuspecting workers. But this time, there's no lever, no switch, no mechanical intervention available. Instead, standing beside you on the bridge is a large person, large enough that if they were to fall onto the tracks, their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 workers below. Of course, this person would die from the impact. Now you could push this person off the bridge. It would save 5 lives at the cost of 1, exactly the same mathematical equation as before. But when presented with this scenario, those same people who would unhesitatingly pull the lever suddenly hesitate. The vast majority, often the same individuals who chose to pull the lever moments before, say they would not push the person off the bridge. Same numbers, same outcome, 5 saved, 1 lost, but something feels fundamentally different, doesn't it? The mathematics haven't changed, but our moral intuition rebels against this version in a way it didn't before. Why? This is where the trolley problem reveals its true purpose. It's not really about trolleys or railways or industrial accidents. It's a window into the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of human moral reasoning. It exposes the fault lines in our ethical thinking, the places where our intuitions clash with our logic, where our emotions wrestle with our reasoning. Some philosophers suggest the difference lies in the distinction between intended and merely foreseen consequences. When you pull the lever, you intend to save 5 lives, and the death of 1 person is a tragic but unintended side effect of your action. When you push someone off the bridge, their death is not a side effect, it's the means by which you save the others. You're using them as a tool, treating them not as an end in themselves, but as a means to an end. Others argue the crucial difference is between killing and letting die. Pulling the lever feels like redirecting harm that already exists. Pushing someone off a bridge feels like actively causing harm that wouldn't otherwise occur. We seem to have different moral intuitions about these 2 types of action, even when the consequences are identical. There's also the question of physical contact and psychological distance. Pulling a lever feels abstract, mechanical, removed. Pushing someone with your own hands feels immediate, personal, visceral. Perhaps our moral intuitions evolved in small communities where the physical act of harming someone with your own hands carried different social and psychological weight than causing harm through indirect means. But the trolley problem doesn't stop there. Philosophers have created dozens of variations, each designed to probe different aspects of our moral reasoning. What if the 1 person on the side track is a child, while the 5 on the main track are elderly? What if the 1 person is a brilliant scientist on the verge of curing cancer, while the 5 are convicted criminals? What if you know the 5 people personally, but the 1 is a stranger? What if it's the reverse? Each variation peels back another layer of our moral intuitions, revealing the complex web of factors that influence our judgments about right and wrong. We don't just consider numbers, we consider relationships, potential, desert, proximity, intention, and countless other variables that resist easy mathematical calculation. And then there are, you're the 1 person on the side, the truly mind-bending variants. What if track and pulling the lever would save 5 others, but cost you your own life? What if the 5 people tied to the tracks are there because they chose to be, perhaps as part of some philosophical experiment, while the 1 person on the side track is an innocent bystander? What if you know that 1 of the 5 people would, if they survived, go on to become a tyrant, responsible for thousands of deaths? Each scenario forces us to examine not just what we would do, but why we would do it, what principles guide our moral reasoning, and whether those principles are consistent across different situations. The trolley problem becomes a mirror, reflecting back to us the complexity and sometimes the inconsistency of our own moral thinking. This is philosophy at its most practical and its most personal. We might never find ourselves standing beside an actual railway switch, but we face trolley-like dilemmas all the time, usually in less dramatic but no less meaningful ways. Every time we make decisions that affect others, how we spend our money, how we vote, how we choose to help or not help those in need, we're navigating questions about the relative weight of different lives, different needs, different claims on our moral attention. The parent who works overtime to provide better opportunities for their own children while being unable to help their neighbour's struggling family. The doctor who must decide how to allocate limited resources between patients. The policymaker choosing between funding programs that help different populations. The individual deciding whether to buy fair trade products that cost more but support better working conditions for distant workers. These aren't runaway trolleys, but they're trolley problems nonetheless, and perhaps that's the real value of this thought experiment. Not that it provides us with clear answers. Indeed, decades of philosophical debate haven't produced consensus on what the right answer is, or even whether there is a single right answer. Instead, it helps us recognize the moral complexity that surrounds us, the weight of our choices, and the importance of thinking carefully about the principles that guide our actions. The trolley problem reminds us that moral reasoning isn't just about following rules or calculating outcomes. It's about wrestling with competing values, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, and accepting that sometimes there are no perfect choices, only choices we can live with. It teaches us humility in the face of moral complexity and compassion for others who might reach different conclusions when facing the same impossible dilemmas. As you lie there in the gentle darkness, perhaps you can feel the weight of that imaginary lever beneath your hand. The choice that seems so clear from a distance becomes murkier up close, doesn't it? The simple becomes complex, the obvious becomes uncertain, and what felt like a straightforward decision reveals itself to be anything but straightforward. This is the beginning of wisdom, recognizing that the most important questions don't always have easy answers, that good people can disagree about fundamental moral issues, and that the work of ethics is not to provide us with simple formulas, but to help us think more carefully, more compassionately, and more humbly about the choices we face. The trolley continues its journey down the track, and we continue ours, carrying with us the questions it raises about duty and consequence, about action and inaction, about the weight of our choices and the complexity of doing right in a complicated world. The question lingers in the stillness of your room, doesn't it? That simple lever, that impossible choice. But as we settle deeper into our philosophical exploration, let's consider what happens when we step back from the tracks entirely and ask a different question. What does our response to the trolley problem reveal about the very nature of moral thinking itself? There's something deeply human about the way we approach this dilemma. Notice how, when first presented with the basic scenario, most people don't immediately launch into complex philosophical analysis. They don't start by consulting moral frameworks or calculating utilities. Instead, they feel something, a gut reaction, an immediate sense of what seems right or wrong. Only afterward do they begin to reason through their choice, to justify or question that initial instinct. This reveals something profound about how we actually make moral decisions in real life. We're not purely rational, calculating machines, weighing options with mathematical precision. We're embodied beings with emotions, intuitions, and deeply ingrained responses that have been shaped by evolution, culture, and personal experience. Our moral thinking emerges from this rich interplay between feeling and reasoning, between instinct and reflection. Consider how your own mind worked through the trolley scenarios. Did you immediately know what you would do, or did you find yourself hesitating, uncertain? Did your answer change as we moved from the lever version to the bridge version? If so, you're experiencing what philosophers call moral particularism, the idea that context matters enormously in ethical reasoning, that what seems right in one situation might feel wrong in another, even when the basic structure appears identical. This isn't a flaw in our moral thinking, it's a feature. The world is endlessly complex, full of nuance and particularity that resists simple rules. A moral system that could handle every possible situation with mechanical precision would have to be so complicated as to be useless, or so simple as to miss what makes each situation unique and meaningful. But this flexibility in our moral intuitions also creates challenges. If our ethical responses can vary based on seemingly irrelevant factors, whether we're pulling a lever or pushing a person, whether we know the individuals involved, whether the scenario is presented to us in the morning when we're alert or late at night when we're tired, then how can we trust our moral judgments at all? Some philosophers have argued that this variability shows we should rely more heavily on systematic ethical theories, frameworks like utilitarianism, which judges actions purely by their consequences, or deontological ethics, which focuses on the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, regardless of outcomes. These approaches promise consistency, a way of making moral decisions that doesn't depend on the vagaries of emotion or the accidents of context. Yet when we try to apply these systematic approaches to the trolley problem, we quickly discover their own limitations. Pure utilitarianism, with its focus on maximizing overall well-being, seems to demand that we pull the lever, push the person off the bridge, and generally sacrifice individuals whenever doing so would produce better overall outcomes. But this leads to conclusions that many find deeply troubling. A willingness to harvest organs from one healthy person to save 5 others, or to punish an innocent person if doing so would prevent greater social unrest. Deontological ethics, with its emphasis on treating people as ends in themselves rather than merely as means, might forbid pushing the person off the bridge while still allowing us to pull the lever. But this creates its own puzzles about when we're using someone as a means and when we're merely allowing unfortunate side effects to occur. Perhaps the real insight of the trolley problem isn't that we need better moral theories, but that we need to be more comfortable with moral complexity itself. Maybe the tension we feel between different scenarios isn't a bug to be fixed, but a feature to be appreciated. Our moral intuitions have evolved over millions of years of social cooperation. They've been refined through countless generations of humans learning to live together, to balance individual needs against collective welfare, to navigate the endless complexities of social life. These intuitions aren't perfect. They can be biased, inconsistent, or poorly suited to modern circumstances. But they're also repositories of wisdom, encoding hard-won insights about what makes human life flourish and what threatens it. When we feel torn about a moral decision, when our gut reaction conflicts with our rational analysis, that tension itself might be information worth taking seriously. This brings us to another layer of the trolley problem's significance. It's not just a thought experiment about specific ethical dilemmas. It's a meditation on the nature of moral agency itself, on what it means to be a being capable of making ethical choices in the first place. Think about the person standing beside those railway tracks, hand hovering over the lever. In that moment, they embody something remarkable about human existence, the capacity to step outside the natural flow of events and make a conscious choice that will shape the world. Unlike the trolley, which simply follows the laws of physics along its predetermined path, the person at the switch represents the introduction of moral agency into a mechanical universe. This is both a tremendous privilege and an enormous burden. With the power to choose comes responsibility. The person who decides whether to pull the lever cannot escape the weight of that decision. Whatever happens, whether they act or refrain from acting, they have become morally implicated in the outcome in a way that the trolley, the tracks, or even the laws of physics never could be. But notice something else about this scenario. The moral agent doesn't have complete control. They can pull the lever or leave it alone, but they cannot stop the trolley entirely, cannot save everyone, cannot eliminate the tragic dimension of the situation altogether. Their agency operates within constraints. Their choice is limited by circumstances they didn't create and cannot fully control. This mirrors our condition more generally. We are moral agents operating within a world we didn't design, facing choices we didn't seek, trying to do right in situations where perfect solutions may not exist. The trolley problem, in its elegant simplicity, captures something essential about the human predicament. We are beings capable of moral choice in a world that doesn't always make moral choice easy or clear. As we contemplate this from the comfort of our beds, safe from runaway trolleys and impossible decisions, there's a temptation to think of moral philosophy as merely an intellectual exercise, a kind of puzzle solving that happens in the abstract realm of thought experiments. But the questions raised by scenarios like these seep into every corner of our lives, often in ways we don't immediately recognize. Consider the choices you made today, how you spent your time, your money, your attention, whether you helped someone who needed assistance or walked past, whether you chose convenience over principle or personal benefit over collective good, whether you spoke up when you witnessed something wrong or remained silent. These weren't trolley problems in the literal sense, but they were moments where your moral agency engaged with the world, where your choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways you might never fully know. The parent deciding how much time to spend working versus being present with their children faces a version of the trolley dilemma. More work might mean better financial security for the family, but less immediate emotional availability. The consumer choosing between a cheaper product and one produced under better working conditions navigates similar territory. The citizen voting in an election weighs different values, different visions of what will produce the most good for the most people. In each case, we find ourselves standing beside metaphorical tracks, our hand hovering over metaphorical levers, trying to discern the right course of action in a world where our choices inevitably involve trade-offs, where doing good in one direction might cause harm in another. The trolley problem doesn't solve these dilemmas for us, but it does something perhaps more valuable. It makes us more thoughtful about them. It reminds us that moral reasoning is hard work, that good people can disagree about fundamental questions, and that the complexity we encounter in ethical thinking isn't a sign of confusion, but a reflection of the genuine complexity of moral life itself. And perhaps, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, there's something oddly comforting in this recognition. The weight of moral choice is real, but it's a weight we share with every other thinking person who has ever faced a difficult decision. We're all standing beside our own sets of tracks, all trying to figure out when to act and when to refrain, when to prioritize one value over another, how to live with integrity in a world that rarely offers perfect choices. The trolley continues its journey through the landscape of philosophical thought, carrying with it questions that have no final answers but never stop being worth asking. In the gentle darkness, as consciousness begins to fade at the edges, we can let those questions settle into that quiet space where wisdom grows. Not the wisdom of certainty, but the deeper wisdom of thoughtful uncertainty, of moral humility, of compassionate engagement with the endless complexity of trying to do right in a complicated world. The trolley rumbles on through our contemplation, but let's pause for a moment and consider something that might surprise you. The trolley problem, for all its philosophical sophistication, actually emerged from a much more personal place than you might expect. Philippa Foot, who first introduced this thought experiment, wasn't sitting in an ivory tower pondering abstract ethical puzzles. She was grappling with very real questions about moral responsibility in the wake of World War II, trying to understand how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how we might better recognize our own moral agency in situations where the stakes are high. This historical context adds another layer to our understanding of the dilemma. When we imagine ourselves standing beside those railway tracks, we're not just engaging in philosophical speculation. We're connecting with a deeper human struggle to understand how moral choices work in a world where the consequences of our actions often extend far beyond what we can see or predict. Consider how this connects to the choices that shaped the 20th century, the bureaucrat filing paperwork that facilitated deportations, the scientist developing technology without considering its ultimate applications, the citizen who voted for policies without fully grasping their human cost. Each was, in their own way, standing beside railway tracks, making decisions about levers they might or might not pull, often without fully understanding the tracks those choices would set in motion. But let's bring this closer to home, into the quiet space where you're listening now. Think about the trolley problems that exist in your own life, the ones that don't involve runaway trains but are no less morally significant. Perhaps you found yourself in a position where you could help someone, but doing so would require sacrifices that felt too large, too complicated, too disruptive to the life you've carefully constructed. Maybe it was a friend going through a difficult time who needed more support than you felt equipped to give. Maybe it was an opportunity to speak up about something you knew was wrong, but doing so would have put your own position at risk. Maybe it was a choice between pursuing your own dreams and fulfilling obligations to family members who depended on you. These situations rarely come with the stark clarity of our railway scenario, but they often carry similar weight. What makes these real-life trolley problems particularly challenging is that we rarely have complete information. In our thought experiment, we can see the tracks clearly, count the people, assess the likely outcomes with mathematical precision. But in actual life, our moral choices usually involve uncertainty, incomplete knowledge, and consequences that unfold over time in ways we cannot predict. You might choose to pull a metaphorical lever, thinking you're preventing harm, only to discover later that your intervention caused different problems you hadn't anticipated. Or you might refrain from acting, believing that non-interference is the most ethical choice, only to learn that your inaction allowed preventable suffering to continue. This uncertainty doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to choose, but it does add layers of complexity that pure philosophical analysis sometimes struggles to capture. Their trolley problem illuminates. The more we think's a beautiful paradox here, that the about ethics, the more we realize how much we don't know. The deeper we dig into questions of right and wrong, the more we discover how much depends on context, relationship, timing, and factors we might never fully understand. This could be paralyzing, but it can also be liberating. If perfect moral knowledge is impossible, then perhaps the goal isn't to make perfect choices, but to make thoughtful ones. Perhaps ethical living isn't about following a predetermined script, but about cultivating the kind of character that can navigate uncertainty with wisdom, compassion, and humility. This brings us to an aspect of the trolley problem that often gets overlooked in academic discussions: the emotional aftermath of moral choice. Our thought experiment typically ends the moment the lever is pulled or left alone, the moment the trolley reaches its destination. But what about the person who made that choice? How do they live with what they've done or failed to do? Imagine you pulled the lever. 5 lives were saved, but 1 person died because of your direct action. Even if you remain convinced that you made the right choice, even if everyone around you agrees that you did what any reasonable person would do, you might still find yourself lying awake at night, thinking about that 1 person. Their face, their family, the life that was cut short because of your decision. Or imagine you didn't pull the lever. 5 people died, but you weren't directly responsible for anyone's death. You simply allowed events to unfold as they would have without your intervention. Yet you might find yourself haunted by those 5 faces, wondering if you could have prevented their deaths, questioning whether your inaction was really morally different from action. This psychological dimension of moral choice is crucial because it reminds us that ethics isn't just about abstract principles or calculated outcomes. It's about how we live with ourselves, how we integrate our choices into our sense of who we are, how we find meaning and peace in a world where every significant decision involves some form of moral weight. The person standing beside those railway tracks isn't just making a choice about other people's lives. They're also choosing what kind of person they want to be, what kind of moral agent they want to embody in the world. This choice will become part of their story, part of how they understand themselves and their relationship to others. And this, perhaps, brings us closer to why the trolley problem has such enduring fascination. It's not really about trolleys or railway switches or even about the specific people on the tracks. It's about us. It's about the fundamental questions that every conscious being must eventually confront. What do I owe to others? How do I balance competing values? What kind of person do I want to be? How do I make choices I can live with in a world where perfect choices may not exist? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. They're worth sitting with, even when they make us uncomfortable, even when they challenge our assumptions or force us to confront the complexity of our own moral thinking. Because in the asking, in the genuine wrestling with these dilemmas, we become more thoughtful, more compassionate, more aware of the weight and privilege of moral agency. As you rest there in the darkness, perhaps you can feel the presence of your own moral agency, quiet but persistent, like a gentle current running beneath the surface of consciousness. Tomorrow you'll face choices, small and large, that will shape your world in ways both visible and invisible. You'll stand beside your own metaphorical railway tracks, your hand hovering over your own metaphorical levers. The trolley problem doesn't tell you what to choose in those moments, but it does something more valuable. It reminds you that you are choosing, that your choices matter, that the world is shaped by the accumulated decisions of beings like yourself, who care enough to wrestle with questions of right and wrong. And in that recognition, there's both weight and wonder. Weight because moral agency comes with responsibility, because our choices have consequences that ripple outward in ways we may never fully understand. Wonder because we are beings capable of stepping outside our immediate self-interest, of caring about others, of trying to make the world a little better through our choices, even when those choices are difficult, uncertain, or incomplete. The trolley continues its philosophical journey, carrying with it not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but deeper understanding, not solutions, but greater awareness of what it means to be a moral agent in a complex world. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's exactly what wisdom looks like. Not the end of questioning, but the beginning of more thoughtful questioning, more compassionate uncertainty, more humble engagement with the endless mystery of trying to live well. In the gentle quiet of your room, as thoughts begin to blur at the edges and consciousness starts its slow drift towards sleep, you carry with you this recognition of your own moral agency. Tomorrow's choices await, and while they may not involve runaway trolleys, they will be no less significant in their own way. You'll meet them with whatever wisdom you've gathered, whatever compassion you've cultivated, whatever courage you can muster to choose thoughtfully in a world that rarely makes such choices easy. The lever waits, patient and silent, in the landscape of ethical possibility, not demanding immediate action, but simply present, a reminder of the power and responsibility that comes with being human, with being capable of choice, with being part of the ongoing story of how conscious beings try to create meaning and goodness in a universe that offers no guarantees but endless opportunities for moral growth. But what happens when we move beyond individual moral reasoning and consider how the trolley problem reveals something fundamental about the nature of moral communities? Because here's something fascinating that emerges when we step back from the immediate dilemma. The way we think about these scenarios is deeply influenced by how we understand our relationships to others and our place within broader networks of care and responsibility. Consider how your intuitions about the trolley dilemma might shift depending on who you imagine standing on those tracks. If the 5 people are strangers and the one person is your closest friend, does the mathematics of 5 versus 1 still feel compelling? What if the one person is your child, your parent, your partner? What if the 5 are people you've never met from a distant country, while the one is your neighbour? These aren't meant to be trick questions designed to expose inconsistencies in our moral thinking. Rather, they illuminate something profound about how ethics actually works in the lived world. We don't exist as isolated individuals making calculations in a moral vacuum. We're embedded in webs of relationship, care, and responsibility that shape not just what we choose, but how we understand the very nature of choice itself. The philosopher Nell Noddings wrote about what she called the ethics of care, suggesting that moral reasoning begins not with abstract principles, but with attention to relationships and responsibilities that grow from genuine connection. From this perspective, the trolley problem's focus on abstract individuals, people reduced to numbers in a moral calculation, might itself be missing something essential about how ethics works. When we care for someone deeply, when we're bound to them by ties of love, friendship, or responsibility, we don't typically think of them as one unit in a utilitarian equation. We think of them as irreplaceable, as mattering in ways that resist mathematical reduction. The parent doesn't love their child because children in general are valuable. They love this particular child, with their specific laugh, their unique way of seeing the world, their irreducible individual presence. But this creates a tension, doesn't it? If we're more responsible for those closer to us, if our moral obligations extend in concentric circles, from family to friends to community to humanity at large, then how do we balance these competing claims? How do we honour our special responsibilities without falling into a narrow parochialism that ignores the needs of distant others? This question becomes particularly acute in our interconnected world, where the consequences of our actions ripple across vast networks of relationship and dependency. The coffee you drink connects you to farmers in distant countries. The clothes you wear link you to workers whose lives you'll never directly encounter. The energy you consume ties you to environmental impacts that will affect people not yet born. In this context, every significant choice becomes a kind of trolley problem. When you purchase something produced under questionable labour conditions because it's more affordable, you're making a calculation about competing values. When you drive instead of walking, when you eat meat instead of vegetables, when you spend money on personal pleasures instead of donating to effective charities, you're navigating questions about your responsibilities to others, both near and distant. The original trolley problem presents these choices in stark, simplified terms that make the moral dimensions visible. But the real trolley problems we face daily are embedded in complex systems of relationship and consequence that resist easy analysis. We're not just choosing between clearly defined outcomes, we're navigating uncertainty about what our choices actually accomplish, about whether our individual actions matter in the face of large-scale problems, about how to balance competing goods in a world where every choice involves trade-offs. And yet perhaps there's wisdom in the very difficulty of these questions. The fact that moral reasoning is hard work might not be a design flaw, but a feature of living in a world rich enough to support genuine ethical choice. If right and wrong were always obvious, if moral decisions required no reflection or struggle, we might live in a simpler world, but also a less meaningful one. The struggle to choose well, to balance competing values, to live with integrity in the face of uncertainty, this might be part of what makes us human in the deepest sense. We are the beings who can recognize moral problems, who can feel torn between different goods, who can experience the weight of responsibility that comes with the power to choose. This brings us to another dimension of the trolley problem that often goes unexplored: the question of moral development over time. The person who first encounters this dilemma at age 20 might respond very differently than they would at 40 or 60, not because their fundamental values have changed, but because life experience has complicated their understanding of choice, consequence, and responsibility. The young person might approach the scenario with confidence, certain that the right answer is clear, and that anyone who sees it differently is either confused or morally deficient. The older person might feel less certain but more compassionate, more aware of how much they don't know, but also more accepting of that uncertainty as part of the human condition. Neither perspective is necessarily superior. The confidence of youth can drive important moral action in the world, while the humility of experience can prevent the kind of rigid thinking that ignores complexity and nuance. What matters is remaining open to growth, to having our moral understanding deepened by encounter with others who see differently, by experiences that challenge our assumptions, by the slow accumulation of wisdom that comes from living thoughtfully in the world. And this is where the trolley problem reveals perhaps its deepest insight. Moral reasoning is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but a capacity to be cultivated throughout a lifetime. Like any capacity, the ability to love, to create, to understand, it grows through practice, through attention, through willingness to engage with difficulty rather than avoiding it. Each time we face a choice that matters, each time we wrestle with competing values or uncertain outcomes, each time we try to discern the right course of action in a complicated situation, we're strengthening our capacity for moral reasoning. We're becoming more thoughtful, more nuanced, more capable of holding complexity without being paralyzed by it. The trolley that began as a simple thought experiment has carried us into territory that's anything but simple. We've explored the tension between action and inaction, between individual and collective good, between abstract principles and particular relationships. We've considered how context shapes moral intuition, how uncertainty complicates ethical choice, how the weight of decision-making affects those who must choose. But perhaps the most important destination on this philosophical journey is the recognition that you're already engaged in this work. Right now, in the quiet space where you're listening, you are a moral agent in the world. Your choices matter. Your reasoning about right and wrong shapes not just your own life, but the lives of others who intersect with your path. This isn't meant to be a burden, though it can feel like one sometimes. It's meant to be a recognition of your significance, of the fact that consciousness comes with both the privilege and responsibility of choice. You matter in the moral fabric of the world, not because you're perfect, not because you always know the right answer, but because you're capable of caring about the question. As your thoughts begin to drift and the sharp edges of analysis soften into something more dreamlike, you might find yourself returning to that image of the person standing beside the railway tracks, hand hovering over the lever, caught between competing values, trying to discern the right path forward in a situation where perfect solutions don't exist. But notice something about this figure. They're not paralyzed by the difficulty of choice. They're engaged with it. They're present to the weight of the moment, aware of what's at stake, taking seriously both the lives that hang in the balance and their own capacity to influence the outcome. They embody what it looks like to be a moral agent in a complex world, not certain, not perfect, but thoughtful and committed to choosing, as well as they can, with the information and wisdom available to them. This is the stance that the trolley problem ultimately invites us to adopt in our own lives. Not the stance of the person who has figured everything out, who has reduced moral reasoning to a simple formula that works in every situation. Rather, the stance of the person who remains open to the difficulty of ethical choice, who takes seriously both the weight of decision and the limits of knowledge, who approaches moral questions with humility and care rather than rigid certainty. In the gentle darkness of your room, as consciousness begins its slow retreat towards sleep, this recognition settles like a quiet blessing. You are a being capable of moral choice in a world that offers endless opportunities for such choice. Tomorrow will bring its own trolley problems, its own moments when you'll stand beside metaphorical tracks with your hand hovering over metaphorical levers. You'll meet those moments with whatever wisdom you've cultivated, whatever compassion you've nurtured, whatever courage you've gathered for the ongoing work of trying to live well. The choices won't always be clear, the outcomes won't always be what you hope, but the choosing itself, the genuine engagement with questions of right and wrong, is part of what makes life meaningful. The trolley continues its journey through the landscape of philosophical possibility, no longer urgent, but somehow eternal, carrying within its simple scenario all the complexity of moral life. It reminds us that we are not just observers of ethical dilemmas, but participants in them. Not just thinkers about moral questions, but actors in the ongoing story of how conscious beings try to create goodness in the world. And in that participation, in that willingness to engage thoughtfully with the hard questions, there's something beautiful and significant. Not the beauty of easy answers or simple solutions, but the deeper beauty of consciousness wrestling with itself, of beings capable of caring about more than their immediate self-interest, of individuals willing to take seriously their place in the larger web of relationship and responsibility that connects all life. The lever waits in the space between sleeping and waking, between certainty and doubt, between action and reflection, not demanding that you pull it or leave it alone, but simply present as a symbol of your own capacity for choice, your own participation in the endless, complex, deeply human work of trying to discern what it means to live ethically in a world that offers no guarantees, but infinite opportunities for moral growth and understanding. In the quiet that follows thought, in the space where philosophy dissolves into rest, you carry this recognition with you. You are a moral agent in the world, capable of choice, responsible for the consequences of your actions, connected to others through bonds both visible and invisible. It's a weight, yes, but it's also a gift. The gift of consciousness, of care, of the capacity to participate meaningfully in the great ongoing experiment of conscious beings, learning to live together with wisdom and compassion. The trolley's whistle fades into the distance, but the questions it carries remain, gentle now, settled into that deep place where understanding lives not as information, but as wisdom, not as answers, but as better ways of being present to the mystery and responsibility of moral life. Now, as we drift further into the philosophical landscape, let's explore something that might seem paradoxical at first. The trolley problem, for all its focus on life and death decisions, might actually teach us the most about how we navigate the smaller, quieter moral choices that make up the texture of daily life. Because while you may never find yourself standing beside an actual railway switch, you encounter the underlying structure of this dilemma far more often than you might realize. Consider the last time you walked past someone asking for help on the street. In that moment, you faced a version of the trolley problem. You could act, offer assistance, give money, stop to listen, or you could continue on your way. The stakes weren't as dramatic as our railway scenario, but the fundamental structure was similar. Action versus inaction. Your comfort and convenience weighed against another person's need. The question of what you owe to strangers and how much of yourself you're obligated to give. Or think about a moment when you witnessed something wrong happening. Maybe someone being treated unfairly, maybe a harmful rumor being spread, maybe a small injustice that others seemed willing to overlook. You stood at your own kind of switch, deciding whether to intervene or remain silent. The trolley of social momentum was already moving in a particular direction, and you had to choose whether to divert its path or allow it to continue. These everyday moral moments rarely come with the clarity of our thought experiment. There's no obvious count of lives at stake, no clear mathematical calculation to guide us. Instead, we navigate uncertainty, incomplete information, and competing values that resist easy comparison. Yet the core challenge remains the same. How do we choose well when our choices have consequences for others? How do we balance our own needs and limitations against our responsibilities to the broader human community? What makes these quotidian dilemmas particularly interesting is how they reveal the social dimension of moral reasoning. The person standing beside the railway tracks in our thought experiment appears to be making an individual choice. But even that scenario is embedded in larger questions about collective responsibility, social institutions, and shared values. Why was there a runaway trolley in the first place? What systems failed to prevent this dangerous situation? Who bears responsibility for creating the conditions that made this tragic choice necessary? When we extend this analysis to real-world situations, these questions become even more complex. The person asking for help on the street exists within larger systems of economic inequality, social support, and collective responsibility. Your choice about whether to help them is meaningful, but it's also embedded within much larger questions about how society organizes itself to care for its most vulnerable members. This doesn't diminish the importance of individual moral choice. Quite the opposite. It reminds us that our individual choices are part of a larger web of collective action and shared responsibility. The parent who volunteers at their child's school, the neighbour who checks on elderly residents during extreme weather, the citizen who votes thoughtfully and stays informed about local issues, each is pulling their own kind of lever, making choices that shape the collective trolley of community life. But here's something beautiful about this broader perspective. It suggests that moral agency isn't just about the dramatic moments when everything hangs in the balance. It's also about the quiet, consistent choices that create the conditions within which those dramatic moments occur. It's about the slow work of building communities where fewer people find themselves in desperate need of help, where systems function well enough that runaway trolleys are rare, where the infrastructure of care and support makes individual moral crises less frequent and less severe. This brings us to what philosophers sometimes call virtue ethics, the idea that moral life is less about following rules or calculating outcomes, and more about cultivating the kind of character that naturally tends toward good choices. From this perspective, the question isn't just, what should I do in this specific situation? But what kind of person do I want to become, and how do my choices shape that becoming? The person who regularly practices small acts of kindness, who pays attention to others' needs, who tries to live with integrity in everyday situations, is developing moral muscles that will serve them well when larger challenges arise. They're not just preparing for hypothetical trolley problems, they're creating the kind of character that makes them more likely to notice when others need help, more skilled at navigating complex moral terrain, more resilient in the face of ethical difficulty. And this is where the long-term perspective becomes particularly important. Moral development isn't something that happens overnight, any more than physical fitness or artistic skill develops instantly. It's a gradual process of practice, reflection, and growth that unfolds over years and decades. The choices you make today don't just affect today's outcomes, they also shape the kind of person you'll be tomorrow, the kind of moral agent you're becoming through the accumulation of countless small decisions. This temporal dimension adds another layer to our understanding of the trolley problem. The person standing beside those tracks isn't just choosing what happens to the people on the railway. They're also choosing what kind of person they become through that choice, what kind of story they'll tell themselves about their own moral agency, what kind of precedent they're setting for future moral decisions. If they pull the lever, they become someone who acts decisively in crisis situations, someone willing to take responsibility for difficult choices, someone who prioritizes saving the greater number, even when doing so requires causing harm. If they don't pull the lever, they become someone who respects the moral distinction between killing and letting die, someone who believes that some actions are wrong regardless of their consequences, someone who refuses to treat individuals as expendable for the greater good. Neither choice is inherently superior, but both are character-forming in ways that extend far beyond the immediate situation. The choice becomes part of their identity, part of how they understand their own moral agency, part of the foundation for future ethical decisions. This is why these dilemmas feel so weighty, even in their hypothetical form. They're not just about external outcomes, but about internal transformation, about who we become through the choices we make. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, perhaps you can sense this ongoing process of moral becoming in your own life. Every choice you've made, Every moment you've chosen kindness over indifference, courage over comfort, truth over convenience has contributed to the person you are now. And every choice you'll make tomorrow will continue that process, continuing to shape the contours of your character, the patterns of your response to moral challenge. This isn't meant to be overwhelming, though the weight of moral agency can sometimes feel that way. It's meant to be encouraging, a recognition that you have agency in shaping not just the world around you, but the person you become through your engagement with that world. Your moral development is an ongoing project, a work of art that you're creating through the medium of choice, day by day, decision by decision. And like any work of art, it doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. The sculptor doesn't abandon the clay because the first attempts are imperfect. The musician doesn't stop practicing because they hit wrong notes. The moral agent doesn't give up on ethical choice because previous decisions were flawed or because future choices will be difficult. Instead, they continue the work, approaching each new situation with whatever wisdom they've gained, whatever compassion they've cultivated, whatever courage they've developed through previous encounters with moral challenge. They understand that moral growth is a lifelong process, that wisdom develops through experience, that character is built through the patient accumulation of thoughtful choices. This long-term view also helps us understand why moral disagreement can be so persistent and so emotionally charged. When people disagree about what the person beside the railway tracks should do, they're not just disagreeing about a particular choice in a particular situation. They're disagreeing about fundamental questions of what it means to live well, what values should guide human action, what kind of character traits we should cultivate, what kind of communities we should build together. These disagreements are often rooted in different life experiences, different cultural backgrounds, different philosophical traditions, different understandings of human nature and moral responsibility. The person who emphasizes the importance of consequences might have learned through experience that good intentions aren't enough, that we must be willing to make hard choices to prevent greater suffering. The person who emphasizes the inherent wrongness of certain actions might have learned that some moral boundaries once crossed fundamentally change who we are in ways that no amount of good consequences can justify. Both perspectives contain wisdom. Both emerge from genuine engagement with the challenges of moral life. Both represent thoughtful attempts to discern how to live well in a complex world. The fact that they sometimes conflict doesn't mean that one is right and the other wrong. It might mean that moral life is rich enough to support multiple legitimate approaches, that the human condition is complex enough to resist simple formulas. This pluralistic understanding doesn't lead to moral relativism, the idea that all choices are equally valid, or that moral reasoning is arbitrary. Instead, it leads to what we might call moral humility, the recognition that other thoughtful people might reach different conclusions than we do, that our own moral understanding is always provisional and open to growth, that the work of ethics is ongoing rather than completed. From this perspective, the value of the trolley problem isn't that it provides definitive answers to moral questions. Instead, its value lies in the quality of thinking it provokes, the way it helps us become more thoughtful and nuanced in our approach to ethical choice, the way it reveals the complexity and beauty of moral reasoning itself. When we engage seriously with these dilemmas, when we allow ourselves to feel the genuine difficulty of moral choice rather than rushing toward easy answers, we develop what philosophers sometimes call moral imagination, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, to understand how different values might conflict, to hold complexity without being paralyzed by it. This moral imagination serves us well, not just in hypothetical scenarios, but in the real moral challenges we face every day. It helps us recognize that the person who disagrees with us might not be foolish or evil, but might be responding to aspects of the situation that we haven't fully considered. It helps us approach moral conflict with curiosity rather than certainty, with compassion rather than judgment. And perhaps most importantly, it helps us remain open to growth, to having our understanding deepened by encounter with different perspectives, by experiences that challenge our assumptions, by the slow accumulation of wisdom that comes from paying attention to the moral dimensions of ordinary life. As your thoughts continue their gentle drift towards sleep, you might find yourself returning to that central image, the person standing beside the railway tracks, hand hovering over the lever, caught between competing values and uncertain outcomes. But perhaps now, this figure represents something different than it did at the beginning of our journey. Perhaps now, they represent not the burden of impossible choice, but the dignity of moral agency itself. The recognition that we are beings capable of caring about more than ourselves, capable of wrestling with difficult questions, capable of growth and development in our capacity for ethical reasoning. The person beside the tracks embodies what it means to be human in the deepest sense, not perfect, not all-knowing, but thoughtful and caring and committed to choosing, as well as they can, with the wisdom available to them. They represent the ongoing human project of learning to live together with justice and compassion, of creating communities where moral reasoning is valued and moral growth is possible. In the quiet space where philosophy meets rest, where conscious reflection gives way to unconscious processing, you carry this recognition with you. You are part of this great ongoing experiment in moral living, this collective effort to discern what it means to choose well in a complex world. The trolley that began as a philosophical puzzle has become something more, a symbol of the moral dimension that runs through all of life, the recognition that consciousness comes with both the privilege and responsibility of choice, the understanding that our individual moral development is part of a larger story about how conscious beings learn to create goodness in the world. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for moral choice, its own moments when you'll stand beside metaphorical tracks with your hand hovering over metaphorical levers. You'll meet those moments with whatever wisdom you've cultivated, whatever compassion you've nurtured, whatever courage you've developed through the patient practice of trying to live well. The choices won't always be clear, the outcomes won't always be what you hope, but the choosing itself, the genuine engagement with questions of right and wrong, remains one of the most fundamentally human activities, one of the ways we participate meaningfully in the ongoing creation of a more thoughtful, more compassionate world. In the gentle silence that follows thought, in the space where analysis dissolves into understanding, the trolley continues its eternal journey through the landscape of moral possibility. It carries with it not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but deeper wisdom, not solutions, but greater capacity for the kind of thoughtful engagement that makes moral life both challenging and beautiful. The lever waits in the space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and wondering, between the complexity of moral reasoning and the simplicity of rest. It reminds us that we are moral agents in the world, that our choices matter, that the work of trying to live ethically is never finished, but always worthwhile. And in that recognition, as consciousness fades and the sharp edges of philosophy soften into the gentler realm of dreams, there's something profoundly peaceful. Not the peace of having solved all moral problems, but the deeper peace of knowing that we're engaged in meaningful work, that our wrestling with questions of right and wrong contributes to the larger human project of learning to live together with wisdom and care. The trolley's whistle grows distant now, but the questions it carries remain, settled into that quiet place where understanding lives not as information, but as wisdom, not as rigid rules, but as flexible capacity for thoughtful response to the endless moral complexity and beauty of human life. Sleep settles over these philosophical waters like morning mist, doesn't it? And as your breathing deepens and thoughts begin their gentle drift away from analysis, we find ourselves in that liminal space where the sharp edges of reasoning soften into something more intuitive, more felt than thought. But before we let the trolley fade entirely into the landscape of dreams, there's one more territory worth exploring, perhaps the most personal of all. Because hidden within this famous thought experiment is a question that goes beyond railways and switches, beyond utilitarian calculations and deontological principles. It's the question of how we live with ourselves after the choosing is done. Picture that person again, standing beside the tracks in the moments after their decision. Whether they pulled the lever or left it alone, whether they acted or refrained from acting, they now carry something new. The weight of consequence, yes, but also something subtler. The knowledge of what they discovered about themselves in that moment of moral clarity. This is where philosophy meets psychology, where abstract ethical reasoning encounters the lived reality of being human. Because moral choices don't exist in isolation. They accumulate over time, creating patterns, shaping identity, building the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we stand for. The person who pulled the lever might find themselves changed in ways they didn't expect. They saved 5 lives, but they also discovered they're someone who can make life and death decisions under pressure, someone who's willing to act when action has terrible costs. This knowledge becomes part of them, influencing how they see themselves and how they approach future moral challenges. Or consider the person who didn't pull the lever. They respected what felt like an important moral boundary, but they also learned there's someone who can watch preventable tragedy unfold without intervening. This too becomes part of their self-understanding, a piece of moral identity that will inform future choices. Neither response is inherently superior, but both are transformative. This is what makes moral philosophy so deeply personal. It's not just about external actions, but about internal becoming, about the slow process through which our choices shape the contours of our character. And here's something beautiful about this process. It never really ends. Every moral challenge we face offers new opportunities for growth, new chances to discover untapped reserves of courage or compassion, new ways to surprise ourselves with our capacity for thoughtful action or principled restraint. The executive who chooses integrity over profit, even when it costs them their position. The parent who admits their mistake to their child, even when it undermines their authority. The friend who tells a difficult truth, even when it strains the relationship. Each of these moments is a kind of trolley problem, a point where values collide and character is revealed. But notice how these real-world scenarios differ from our philosophical thought experiments. They're messier, more ambiguous, embedded in relationships and histories that resist clean analysis. The outcomes unfold over time in ways that can't be predicted. The moral weight is distributed differently, less dramatic perhaps, but more persistent. This is where the true work of ethics happens, not in the rarefied air of philosophical seminars, but in the daily practice of trying to live with integrity in a world that constantly presents us with competing goods, conflicting loyalties, and uncertain outcomes. It's in these ordinary moments that we develop what we might call moral fitness, the capacity to navigate ethical complexity with grace and wisdom. Think about someone you admire for their moral character. Chances are, it's not because they solved a famous philosophical puzzle or delivered a brilliant ethical argument. It's because they've consistently made choices that reflect deep values, because they've shown courage in difficult situations, because they've maintained their principles even when doing so was costly or inconvenient. This kind of character isn't built through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of countless small choices. The decision to listen carefully when someone is sharing their pain, the choice to admit ignorance rather than pretend knowledge, the willingness to change course when new information suggests you've been wrong, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. Each of these moments is a point where character is either strengthened or weakened, where moral muscles are either exercised or allowed to atrophy. And like physical fitness, moral fitness is something that must be maintained through regular practice. We don't develop ethical strength by avoiding moral challenges any more than we develop physical strength by avoiding exercise. This brings us to a paradox that lies at the heart of moral development. The people who are best at handling ethical dilemmas are often those who find them most difficult, not because they lack clarity about their values, but because they understand the full weight of moral choice, the genuine difficulty of balancing competing goods, the sobering reality that even well-intentioned actions can have unintended consequences. The person who approaches moral decisions with easy confidence may be revealing not wisdom, but a kind of ethical blindness, an inability to see the full complexity of the situation, the multiple perspectives that deserve consideration, the various ways that good people might reasonably disagree about the right course of action. True moral maturity often looks less like certainty and more like thoughtful uncertainty, less like rigid adherence to rules and more like flexible wisdom that can adapt to context while maintaining core principles. It's the difference between the person who says, "The answer is obvious," and the person who says, "This is difficult, but here's how I'm thinking about it." This doesn't mean that all moral choices are equally valid or that ethical reasoning is purely subjective. Rather, it means that the most important moral decisions often require us to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to acknowledge the legitimate claims of different values, to make choices while remaining humble about our own limitations and open to the possibility that we might be wrong. And perhaps this is where the trolley problem's greatest gift lies, not in the answers it provides, but in the humility it cultivates. By presenting us with a scenario where thoughtful people disagree, where different ethical frameworks yield different conclusions, where both action and inaction carry moral weight, it reminds us that moral reasoning is an ongoing process rather than a finished product. This humility serves us well in our actual moral lives, where we're constantly navigating relationships with people who hold different values, who've had different experiences, who see the world through different lenses. The capacity to disagree about fundamental questions while maintaining respect and care for each other. This might be one of the most important skills we can develop in our increasingly complex and interconnected world. Consider how this plays out in your own relationships. The friend who makes different choices about work-life balance than you do. The family member who prioritizes different values in their parenting approach. The colleague who has different ideas about what constitutes ethical business practice. These differences can be sources of conflict, but they can also be opportunities for growth, chances to expand our understanding of what moral wisdom might look like. When we approach these differences with curiosity rather than judgment, when we're genuinely interested in understanding how other thoughtful people reach different conclusions, we often discover that our own moral thinking becomes richer and more nuanced. We might not change our fundamental convictions, but we might develop a more sophisticated understanding of how those convictions apply in complex situations. This is particularly important in our current cultural moment, when moral and political disagreements often seem to generate more heat than light, when people with different perspectives are increasingly likely to live in separate information bubbles, when the capacity for genuine dialogue across difference feels increasingly rare. The trolley problem, in its elegant simplicity, offers a model for how we might engage with moral disagreement more productively. It presents a genuine dilemma where reasonable people disagree, and it invites us to explore those disagreements thoughtfully rather than dismissing them reflexively. When someone reaches a different conclusion about the trolley scenario than you do, the interesting question isn't how can they be so wrong, but what are they seeing that I might be missing? What life experiences, what philosophical commitments, what moral intuitions are shaping their response? How might their perspective illuminate aspects of the dilemma that I hadn't fully considered? This kind of intellectual humility doesn't require us to abandon our own convictions, but it does ask us to hold them more lightly, to remain open to the possibility that other perspectives might have something valuable to teach us. And this openness, paradoxically, often makes our own convictions stronger and more resilient, because they've been tested against other viewpoints and refined through genuine engagement with alternative approaches. As the night deepens around you and consciousness continues its gentle retreat towards sleep, perhaps you can feel this process happening in your own mind. The sharp certainties of daytime reasoning softening into something more flexible, more receptive to complexity and ambiguity. The questions raised by our philosophical trolley settling into that deeper layer of awareness, where wisdom develops not through argument but through patient contemplation. This is how moral understanding actually grows, not through the accumulation of rules or the memorization of principles, but through the slow cultivation of practical wisdom, the kind of understanding that emerges from years of thoughtful engagement with ethical challenges, both large and small. The parent learns not just from parenting books, but from the daily practice of trying to balance love with discipline, protection with independence, their child's immediate happiness with their long-term flourishing. The teacher develops wisdom not just from educational theory, but from years of trying to reach students with different needs, different backgrounds, different ways of learning. The friend, the citizen, the professional, each develops moral understanding through the patient practice of trying to live well within their particular role and circumstances. And this understanding is always provisional, always open to revision, always growing through encounter with new challenges and new perspectives. This is why moral philosophy matters not as an academic exercise, but as a form of practical wisdom, a way of developing the capacities we need to navigate the ethical dimensions of ordinary life. The trolley may be imaginary, but the moral muscles we exercise in thinking about it are very real. The habits of thought we develop through philosophical reflection, the willingness to consider multiple perspectives, the ability to hold complexity without being paralyzed by it, the courage to make difficult choices while remaining open to growth, these serve us well in every area of life. And perhaps most importantly, they help us develop what we might call moral courage. Not the dramatic courage of heroes in extraordinary circumstances, but the quiet, everyday courage required to live with integrity in ordinary situations. The courage to admit when we're wrong. The courage to stand up for our convictions even when doing so is inconvenient. The courage to extend compassion to people who see the world differently than we do. This kind of courage isn't flashy or dramatic, but it's the foundation upon which healthy communities are built. It's what allows us to disagree without demonizing each other, to maintain relationships across difference, to work together on shared challenges, even when we don't agree on everything. The person standing beside those railway tracks, whatever they ultimately decide, embodies this kind of courage. They're present to the difficulty of the moment, taking seriously both the weight of choice and the limits of their knowledge. They represent what moral agency looks like in practice, not perfect, not all-knowing, but thoughtful and committed to choosing, as well as they can, with the wisdom available to them. And this, perhaps, is the most important lesson the trolley problem has to offer. That moral life is not about finding perfect answers, but about developing the character and wisdom needed to engage thoughtfully with difficult questions. It's about becoming the kind of person who can face ethical challenges with courage, humility, and care. In the gentle quiet of your room, as thoughts continue their slow dissolution into the softer realm of sleep, this recognition settles like a quiet blessing. You are already engaged in this work of moral development, already participating in the great human project of learning to live together with wisdom and compassion. Every choice you make, every moment you choose kindness over indifference, truth over convenience, courage over comfort, contributes to this ongoing work. Every time you listen carefully to someone who disagrees with you, every time you admit uncertainty rather than pretending knowledge, every time you extend grace to someone who's made a mistake, you're strengthening the moral fabric of the world. The trolley that began as a philosophical puzzle has become something more, a symbol of our shared capacity for moral growth, a reminder that consciousness comes with both the privilege and responsibility of choice, an invitation to approach ethical questions with the kind of thoughtful engagement that makes both individual and collective flourishing possible. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for moral choice, its own chances to exercise the capacities we've been exploring. You'll meet those opportunities with whatever wisdom you've cultivated, whatever compassion you've developed, whatever courage you've gathered through the patient practice of trying to live well. The choices won't always be clear, the outcomes won't always be what you hope, but the choosing itself, the genuine engagement with questions of right and wrong, remains one of the most fundamentally human activities, one of the ways we participate meaningfully in the ongoing creation of a more thoughtful, more compassionate world. And in that participation, in that willingness to wrestle thoughtfully with difficult questions, there's something profoundly meaningful. Not the meaning of easy answers or simple solutions, but the deeper meaning that comes from engaging fully with the complexity and beauty of moral life, from recognizing our own agency and using it wisely, from contributing our own small part to the vast, ongoing human experiment in learning to live together with justice and care. The lever waits in the space between conscious reflection and unconscious rest, between the sharp focus of philosophical analysis and the gentle receptivity of sleep. It reminds us that we are moral agents in the world, that our choices matter, that the work of trying to live ethically is never finished but always worthwhile, always meaningful, always part of something larger and more beautiful than ourselves. In the quiet that follows thought, in the space where questions dissolve, not into answers, but into deeper questions, the trolley continues its journey through the landscape of moral possibility. It carries with it the recognition that we are beings capable of caring about more than ourselves, capable of growth and change, capable of contributing to the slow, patient work of making the world a little more thoughtful, a little more compassionate, a little more worthy of the consciousness that inhabits it. The whistle fades into the distance, but the questions remain, settled now into that deep place where wisdom grows, not through argument but through patient contemplation, not through certainty but through the kind of thoughtful uncertainty that keeps us open to growth, to surprise, to the endless mystery and responsibility of trying to live well in a complex and beautiful world. Sleep comes in gentle waves now, doesn't it? And as your mind settles into that peaceful space between waking thought and dreams, let's drift towards something that might surprise you about the trolley problem. It's not really about trolleys at all. It's about time and how the weight of moral decisions ripples forward and backward through the fabric of our lives in ways we rarely pause to consider. Think about the person standing beside those tracks 1 year later. How do they remember that moment? How has it shaped the way they see themselves, the way they approach new challenges, the way they understand their place in the web of human relationships? The immediate crisis has long since passed, but the choice they made continues to live within them, becoming part of their story, part of the lens through which they interpret future moral challenges. This temporal dimension of ethics reveals something profound about the nature of moral agency. We often think about right and wrong as if they exist in discrete moments, as if moral choices happen in isolation from the larger arc of a life being lived. But character develops over time, like sediment slowly accumulating on the ocean floor. Each choice we make becomes part of the geological layers of who we are, influencing not just what we do, but how we see, how we feel, how we respond to the next moral challenge that presents itself. Consider how your own moral intuitions have shifted over the years. The things that seemed obviously right or wrong when you were younger might appear more complex now, not because you've abandoned your principles, but because life has taught you about nuance, about unintended consequences, about the ways that good intentions can sometimes lead to unexpected outcomes. You've developed what philosophers call practical wisdom, the kind of understanding that comes not from books, but from the patient accumulation of experience with the actual texture of moral life. This wisdom manifests in subtle ways. The parent who learns that sometimes the most loving thing they can do is step back and let their child make their own mistakes. The friend who discovers that listening can be more helpful than offering advice. The citizen who realizes that the political candidate who sounds most appealing might not be the one who can actually accomplish the most good. These insights don't come from abstract reasoning, but from years of trying to live well in a world where the relationship between intention and outcome is often mysterious. And this brings us to something that formal philosophy sometimes misses about moral decision-making, the role of intuition, of what we might call moral perception. Before we reason about ethical dilemmas, we see them. We notice the person who needs help. We recognize the situation where intervention might be needed. We feel the tension when our values come into conflict. This seeing, this moral perception, is itself a skill that develops over time through attention and practice. The person who consistently notices when others are struggling, who picks up on subtle signs of distress that others might miss, who has developed sensitivity to the ethical dimensions of seemingly ordinary interactions, this person has cultivated something precious. They've developed what we might call moral awareness, the capacity to recognize the moments when character is being formed, when choices matter in ways that extend far beyond their immediate consequences. But this awareness can also be a burden. Once you begin to see the moral dimensions of daily life clearly, it becomes harder to move through the world with unconscious ease. The simple act of purchasing coffee becomes entangled with questions about fair trade and labour practices. The choice of where to live involves considerations about community, environment, and social responsibility. The decision about how to spend a free evening carries weight about relationships, personal growth, and service to others. This is why moral development is often accompanied by a certain kind of fatigue, a recognition of how complex and demanding ethical living can be. It's easier to make decisions when you don't think too deeply about their implications, when you don't consider the full web of relationships and consequences that radiate out from every choice. But once that awareness develops, once you begin to see clearly, there's no going back to the comfortable simplicity of moral unconsciousness. Yet there's something beautiful about this complexity, something that speaks to the richness of human existence. We are beings capable of caring about more than our immediate self-interest, capable of taking into account the needs and perspectives of others, capable of weighing present desires against future consequences. This capacity for moral reasoning is one of the most remarkable features of consciousness, one of the things that makes human life meaningful in ways that extend far beyond individual survival and pleasure. And it's in this context that the trolley problem reveals its deepest significance. It's not just a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror that reflects back to us our own capacity for ethical reasoning, our own participation in the ongoing human project of learning to live together with wisdom and care. When we wrestle with the dilemma of the runaway trolley, we're not just thinking about an imaginary scenario. We're exercising the same moral muscles that we use every day to navigate the real ethical challenges of ordinary life. The parent deciding how much freedom to give their teenager is facing a version of the trolley problem. They could intervene more actively, preventing potential mistakes, but also limiting growth and independence. Or they could step back, allowing natural consequences to unfold while risking more serious harm. The mathematics aren't as clear as 5 lives versus 1, but the underlying structure is similar. Competing values, uncertain outcomes, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that whatever they choose will have consequences that ripple forward in time. Or consider the teacher who notices a student struggling, but isn't sure whether to reach out directly or respect their privacy. The manager who sees a colleague being treated unfairly but must weigh the benefits of intervention against the potential costs to team dynamics and their own position. The citizen who witnesses something troubling but isn't sure whether speaking up will help or make things worse. Each of these situations requires the same kind of moral reasoning that the trolley problem illuminates: the ability to see multiple perspectives, to weigh competing values, to make choices under conditions of uncertainty while taking responsibility for the outcomes. These are not abstract philosophical skills, but practical capacities that we use constantly in navigating the ethical dimensions of daily life. And here's something that makes these real-world applications even more complex than our railway thought experiment. They're embedded in relationships that extend over time. The choice you make today about how to respond to a friend's request for help doesn't just affect this moment. It becomes part of the history of your friendship, part of the pattern of how you show up for each other, part of the foundation for future trust and intimacy. This relational dimension of ethics adds layers of meaning that formal moral philosophy sometimes struggles to capture. When we care about someone deeply, when we're committed to their well-being over the long term, our moral reasoning becomes less about abstract calculations and more about understanding what kind of presence, what kind of response, what kind of choice will serve the relationship and the people within it most fully. The parent who chooses not to rescue their adult child from the consequences of their choices isn't being callous. They're making a complex judgment about what kind of help actually helps, about how to balance immediate compassion with long-term growth, about how to love someone in a way that honors their agency and supports their development. This kind of moral reasoning requires not just ethical principles, but deep understanding of the particular people involved, their history, their needs, their capacity for growth. Similarly, the friend who chooses to tell a difficult truth rather than offering comfortable reassurance is navigating territory that goes far beyond simple rule following. They're making judgments about timing, about their friend's readiness to hear hard things, about their own capacity to offer this truth with genuine love, rather than disguised anger or superiority. The moral weight of the choice lies not just in its immediate impact, but in how it affects the long-term health and honesty of the relationship. This is where ethics becomes art as much as science, where moral reasoning requires not just logical analysis, but intuition, empathy, and what we might call relational wisdom. The capacity to sense what someone needs, to understand how they're likely to receive different kinds of responses, to calibrate our choices, not just according to abstract principles, but according to the particular dynamics of this relationship with this person at this moment in time. And this brings us back to the question of moral development over time. The person who develops skill at this kind of relational ethics doesn't do so overnight. It happens through years of making mistakes, learning from them, paying attention to outcomes, developing sensitivity to the subtle ways that choices ripple through relationships and communities. It's a form of practical wisdom that emerges through experience, through trial and error, through the patient cultivation of attention and care. The teenager who learns that being right isn't always more important than being kind. The young adult who discovers that sometimes the most generous thing they can do is receive help gracefully, rather than always insisting on giving it. The parent who realizes that their child needs space to make their own mistakes, more than they need protection from all possible harm. Each of these insights represents a deepening of moral understanding, a growth in the capacity to navigate ethical complexity with greater skill and wisdom. But this development isn't linear or predictable. Sometimes we think we've learned important lessons only to find ourselves making similar mistakes in new contexts. Sometimes insights that served us well in one relationship or situation prove inadequate when applied elsewhere. The work of moral development is ongoing, requiring constant attention, constant willingness to learn and grow, and adapt our understanding to new circumstances. This is why humility is such an important virtue in ethical life. Not the false humility that refuses to take stands or make difficult choices, but the genuine humility that recognizes how much we don't know, how much our perspective is shaped by our particular experiences and limitations, how much wisdom there is still to be gained through continued engagement with the challenges of living well. The person standing beside those railway tracks embodies this kind of humility. They don't pretend to have perfect knowledge of all the consequences that will flow from their choice. They don't claim certainty about what the right answer is. Instead, they engage thoughtfully with the information available to them. They consider the values at stake. They make the best choice they can with the wisdom they've developed, and they accept responsibility for the outcomes while remaining open to learning from whatever follows. This stance, thoughtful engagement combined with humble recognition of limitation, might be the most important thing we can cultivate in our moral lives. It allows us to take ethical questions seriously without becoming paralyzed by their complexity. It enables us to make choices while remaining open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that there might be perspectives we haven't considered, that wisdom might require changing course as new information becomes available, and it creates space for genuine dialogue with others who see things differently. When we approach moral disagreements from this stance of humble engagement, we're more likely to be curious about other perspectives. Rather than defensive about our own, we're more capable of learning from people who've had different experiences, who bring different wisdom to bear on shared challenges, who might help us see aspects of situations that we've overlooked. As your breathing continues to slow and deepen, as the sharp edges of analytical thinking soften into something more receptive and intuitive, perhaps you can feel this process of moral development happening in your own life. The slow accumulation of experience, the gradual refinement of judgment, the growing capacity to hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. It's happening even now, in the quiet space of reflection, in the gentle consideration of these questions that have no easy answers but never stop being worth asking. The trolley that began as a simple thought experiment has carried us deep into the territory of moral psychology, into questions about how character develops over time, how relationships shape ethical reasoning, how wisdom emerges through the patient practice of trying to live well. It has reminded us that moral philosophy isn't just an academic exercise, but a practical discipline, a way of developing the capacities we need to navigate the ethical dimensions of ordinary life with greater skill and care. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to exercise these capacities, new moments when you'll stand beside your own metaphorical railway tracks, considering competing values and uncertain outcomes, trying to discern the path that leads toward greater flourishing for yourself and others. You'll meet those moments with whatever wisdom you've cultivated, whatever humility you've developed, whatever courage you've gathered for the ongoing work of moral engagement. The choices won't always be clear, the outcomes won't always match your intentions, but the choosing itself, the genuine wrestling with questions of right and wrong, remains one of the most fundamentally human activities, one of the ways we participate meaningfully in the slow, patient work of creating communities where wisdom and compassion can flourish. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, as conscious reflection gives way to the deeper processing of sleep, you carry this recognition with you. You are a moral agent in the world, capable of growth and learning, embedded in relationships that both challenge and support your development, participating in the great ongoing experiment of conscious beings learning to live together with greater wisdom and care. The trolley continues its journey through the landscape of ethical possibility, no longer urgent but somehow eternal, carrying within its simple scenario all the complexity of moral life as it's actually lived. It reminds us that we are not just observers of ethical dilemmas, but participants in them. Not just thinkers about moral questions, but actors in the ongoing story of how consciousness engages with the challenge of creating goodness in the world. And in that participation, in that willingness to engage thoughtfully with difficult questions over the long arc of a lifetime, there's something profoundly meaningful. Not the meaning of easy answers or simple formulas, but the deeper meaning that comes from recognizing our capacity for moral growth, from taking seriously our responsibility to others, from contributing our own small part to the vast, ongoing human project of learning to live together with justice and compassion. The lever waits in the space between reflection and rest, between the complexity of ethical analysis and the simplicity of sleep. It reminds us that moral agency is both a gift and a responsibility, both a burden and a privilege, both a challenge that demands our best thinking and a practice that unfolds through the patient accumulation of choices made with as much wisdom and care as we can muster. In the quiet that follows conscious thought, in the space where questions settle, not into answers but into deeper understanding, the trolley fades into the gentle landscape of dreams. But the recognition it carries remains, woven now into the fabric of rest reasoning, capable of caring about more than ourselves. The understanding that we are beings capable of moral, capable of growth and change and contribution to the slow work of making the world a little more thoughtful, a little more compassionate, a little more worthy of the consciousness that inhabits it. The whistle grows soft and distant, but the questions linger in that deep place where wisdom develops not through argument, but through contemplation, not through certainty, but through the kind of patient engagement that keeps us open to learning, to surprise, to the endless mystery and responsibility of trying to live well in a complex and beautiful world. Sleep comes now, like a gentle tide, carrying with it the quiet recognition that moral life is not a problem to be solved, but a capacity to be cultivated, not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be travelled with as much thoughtfulness and care as we can bring to each step along the way. The morning after that impossible choice, what remains? Not just the consequences rippling outward through time, but something more intimate, more personal. The weight of having stood at that crossroads where abstract philosophy became lived reality, where theoretical ethics transformed into the substance of memory and identity. Perhaps you've noticed this in your own life, how certain decisions, even relatively small ones, continue to live within you years after the moment has passed. The choice to speak up or remain silent in a meeting where someone was being treated unfairly, the decision to help a stranger in distress or hurry past with averted eyes, the moment when you chose honesty over convenience or compassion over judgment, even when it cost you something precious. These moments accumulate over time, like layers of sediment, gradually forming the bedrock of character. Each choice becomes part of the internal landscape we navigate, part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we stand for. The person who pulled the lever carries that action forward into every subsequent moral challenge, not as a burden, but as information about their own capacity for decisive action under pressure. But here's something curious about moral memory. It's rarely the dramatic moments that define us most profoundly. More often, it's the quiet choices, the seemingly insignificant decisions that nobody else notices, the small acts of integrity or kindness or courage that happen when no one is watching and no recognition will follow. The trolley scenario presents ethics in high relief, with stark choices and clear stakes. But most moral life happens in softer tones, in the grey areas where right and wrong blur into each other like watercolours in the rain. It's in these subtle moments that character is most authentically revealed and most meaningfully formed. Consider the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, not because it's required or rewarded, but because something in their understanding of their role compels this extra effort. Or the neighbour who consistently takes in packages for busy households on their street, performing small acts of community care that no one thinks to acknowledge. Or the parent who chooses patience over efficiency in those countless daily moments when a child needs extra time, extra explanation, extra grace. These choices don't generate philosophical debate or academic papers, but they shape the moral texture of daily life in ways that grand gestures rarely match. They represent what we might call the ethics of presence, the moral significance of how we show up in ordinary moments, how we attend to the needs around us, how we contribute to the subtle but crucial work of making shared spaces more humane. And this brings us to something that formal moral philosophy sometimes overlooks: the role of emotion in ethical reasoning. When we encounter the trolley problem in academic settings, we're often encouraged to set aside our feelings and focus on rational analysis. But in real moral life, emotion isn't a distraction from ethical reasoning. It's an integral part of it. The capacity for empathy allows us to understand how our choices might affect others. Compassion motivates us to act on behalf of those who are suffering. Moral anger alerts us to injustice and energizes our response to it. Love shapes our understanding of what we owe to those who matter most to us. Fear reminds us of our own vulnerability and helps us recognize when others might be feeling similarly threatened. These emotions aren't obstacles to clear moral thinking. They're sources of moral information, ways that our embodied consciousness perceives and responds to the ethical dimensions of situations. The person who feels nothing when confronted with others' suffering may reach logically consistent conclusions, but they're missing crucial data about what's actually at stake in moral choices. This emotional dimension of ethics helps explain why moral disagreements can feel so intense, so personal, so difficult to resolve through rational argument alone. When people disagree about what the person beside the railway track should do, they're not just disagreeing about abstract principles, they're drawing on different emotional experiences, different patterns of care and concern, different ways of feeling their connection to others and their responsibility for outcomes. The person whose moral intuitions have been shaped by experiences of powerlessness might feel strongly that we must act when we have the ability to prevent harm, even if that action requires causing different harm. The person whose formative experiences involve being used or manipulated might feel equally strongly that we must never treat individuals merely as means to an end, regardless of the consequences. Neither perspective is purely rational or purely emotional. Both emerge from the complex interplay between thinking and feeling that characterizes human moral reasoning. Both represent genuine wisdom gained through encounter with the challenges of living ethically in a world where good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, where caring deeply sometimes requires difficult choices. This integration of emotion and reason in moral life suggests that ethical development isn't just about learning principles or improving our logical analysis. It's also about cultivating what we might call emotional wisdom, the ability to feel appropriately in response to moral situations, to have our emotions inform rather than override our reasoning, to use both heart and mind in discerning how to respond to ethical challenges. The parent who learns to distinguish between anxiety and genuine concern for their child's welfare, the friend who develops skill at feeling empathy without being overwhelmed by others' emotions, the citizen who can feel appropriate anger at injustice while maintaining enough emotional equilibrium to respond constructively rather than destructively. Each represents a form of moral maturity that emerges through the patient integration of feeling and thinking over time. But this integration is never complete, never finished. We continue throughout our lives to encounter situations that challenge our existing patterns of moral response, that require us to develop new capacities for ethical reasoning and emotional wisdom. The person who handles conflict well in professional settings might struggle with family dynamics. The individual who's skilled at one-on-one moral reasoning might feel lost when trying to navigate the ethics of larger social and political questions. This ongoing nature of moral development means that humility remains essential throughout the journey. Not the paralyzing humility that refuses to make choices or take stands, but the generative humility that recognizes how much there is still to learn, how much our current understanding might be expanded by encounter with different perspectives and new challenges. And this brings us to one of the most beautiful aspects of moral life, its fundamentally social character. While the trolley problem presents us with a solitary figure making an individual choice, most real moral reasoning happens in relationship with others. We develop our ethical understanding through conversation, through observing how people we admire handle difficult situations, through the give and take of community life, where different values come into contact and must find ways to coexist. The child learns about fairness not just from abstract instruction, but from playground interactions, where resources must be shared and conflicts resolved. The teenager develops moral reasoning through friendships that require balancing loyalty with honesty, acceptance with accountability. The adult continues this education through partnerships, parenthood, professional relationships, and civic engagement, where ethical principles must be applied in contexts that resist simple solutions. Each of these relationships becomes a laboratory for moral development, a space where we can test our understanding against the complexity of actual human interaction, where we can observe the gap between our intentions and their reception, where we can learn from mistakes and refine our capacity for ethical response. The friend who learns that good advice isn't always what someone needs most. Sometimes they need presence more than solutions, validation more than correction, space more than intervention. The colleague who discovers that treating everyone identically isn't the same as treating everyone fairly. Different people have different needs, different backgrounds, different obstacles to overcome. The neighbor who realizes that helping others effectively requires understanding not just what they lack, but what they value, not just what seems obviously beneficial, but what serves their own vision of flourishing. Each of these insights emerges through the patient practice of trying to be helpful in relationships where the other person's perspective might differ significantly from our own. This relational dimension of moral life also helps us understand why ethical reasoning can't be reduced to simple formulas or universal principles. What constitutes appropriate response varies not just with abstract circumstances, but with the particular dynamics of specific relationships, the history shared between individuals, the cultural contexts that shape how actions are likely to be understood and received. The gesture that communicates care in one relationship might feel intrusive in another. The level of honesty that strengthens one friendship might damage a different one. The approach to conflict that works well in one family system might be counterproductive in another. Moral wisdom requires not just understanding general principles, but developing sensitivity to the particular features that make each relationship unique. This particularization of ethics doesn't lead to moral relativism, the idea that all choices are equally valid or that ethical reasoning is purely arbitrary. Instead, it leads to what philosophers call contextual universalism, the recognition that while core values like compassion, justice, and respect for persons remain constant, their application must be sensitive to the specific features of particular situations and relationships. The universal commitment to treating others with dignity gets expressed differently, depending on whether we're interacting with a close friend who needs honest feedback, a stranger who requires basic courtesy, a child who needs both love and appropriate boundaries, or an elderly person who deserves respect for their experience and autonomy. The underlying value remains consistent, but its manifestation adapts to context. And this brings us back to the question of how we live with ourselves after making difficult moral choices. Because part of what makes these decisions so weighty is the recognition that they're not just about external outcomes, but about who we become through the process of choosing. Each moral decision is simultaneously a choice about how to act and a choice about what kind of person to be. The individual who consistently chooses courage over comfort gradually becomes someone who can be relied upon in crisis situations. The person who regularly prioritizes honesty over social ease develops a reputation for trustworthiness that shapes how others interact with them. The individual who makes fairness a priority in daily choices builds patterns of response that influence their approach to larger questions of justice. But this character formation isn't automatic or guaranteed. It requires attention, reflection, and willingness to learn from both successes and failures. The person who acts courageously in one situation might discover they lack courage in another. The individual who's honest in some contexts might find themselves tempted toward deception in others. Character develops unevenly through the accumulation of choices that sometimes reinforce existing patterns and sometimes challenge us to grow in new directions. This uneven development means that moral maturity often looks less like consistent perfection and more like increasing self-awareness, greater honesty about our own limitations, and deeper commitment to continued growth. The person who's developed genuine ethical wisdom typically knows themselves well enough to recognize their own areas of weakness, their own temptations toward moral compromise, their own blind spots that require ongoing attention. Such self-knowledge isn't discouraging, but liberating, because it allows for more intentional choice about where to focus energy for continued moral development. The person who knows they struggle with anger can work more deliberately on cultivating patience. The individual who recognizes their tendency toward people-pleasing can practice setting appropriate boundaries. The person who's aware of their inclination to judge harshly can focus on developing greater compassion. This ongoing work of moral development happens largely in the quiet spaces of ordinary life, in moments too subtle for others to notice, but significant for the person doing the choosing. It's in these private moments that character is most authentically revealed and most meaningfully shaped. The student who doesn't cheat on an exam even when they know they won't be caught. The employee who reports their own mistake even though no one else would likely notice. The friend who keeps a confidence even when sharing it might bring social benefit. The parent who admits their error to their child even when maintaining the pretense of parental infallibility might seem easier. These choices don't generate headlines or philosophical debates, but they represent the real substance of moral life, the daily practice through which individuals gradually become the kind of people they want to be, the kind of people their communities need them to be, the kind of people who can be trusted with the ongoing work of creating a more ethical world. As your breathing deepens and consciousness begins its gentle drift towards sleep, perhaps you can sense this ongoing process in your own life. The slow accumulation of choices, the gradual refinement of moral intuition, the growing capacity to recognize ethical dimensions in situations where they might once have remained invisible. It's happening even now, in this quiet space of reflection, in this willingness to engage thoughtfully with questions that have no easy answers, but never stop being worth asking. The trolley that began as a simple philosophical puzzle has carried us deep into the territory of lived ethics, into questions about how character develops over time, how relationships shape moral reasoning, how individuals contribute to the collective work of creating communities where wisdom and compassion can flourish. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to exercise these developing capacities, new moments when the abstract becomes concrete, when philosophical reflection transforms into practical choice. You'll meet those moments with whatever wisdom you've cultivated, whatever self-awareness you've developed, whatever commitment you've made to the ongoing work of moral growth. The person standing beside those railway tracks, in all their uncertainty and weight of responsibility, represents something beautiful about human existence, our capacity to care about more than ourselves, our ability to wrestle thoughtfully with difficult questions, our commitment to choosing as well as we can, even when perfect solutions aren't available. In the gentle quiet that surrounds you now, as analytical thinking gives way to the deeper processing of rest, you carry this recognition with you. You are a moral agent in the world, embedded in relationships that both challenge and support your development, participating in the great ongoing experiment of conscious beings learning to live together with greater wisdom, compassion, and care. The trolley continues its eternal journey through the landscape of ethical possibility, no longer urgent but somehow timeless, carrying within its simple scenario all the complexity of moral life as it's actually lived by imperfect beings doing their best to create goodness in an uncertain world. And perhaps this is where we arrive at the most personal question of all. Not what the right choice would be in some hypothetical scenario, but how we cultivate the kind of presence that allows us to recognize moral moments when they arise in our own lives. Because here's something that often goes unnoticed in philosophical discussions. The vast majority of ethical opportunities pass by unrecognized, invisible to minds that haven't developed the capacity to see them. The colleague who's struggling with a personal crisis but hasn't explicitly asked for help. The cashier who's clearly having a difficult day but continues serving customers with forced politeness. The neighbor whose small acts of kindness have gone unacknowledged for months. The friend whose enthusiasm about something important to them meets only distracted half attention from those around them. These moments don't announce themselves with the clarity of runaway trolleys and railway switches. They whisper rather than shout. They suggest rather than demand. They offer themselves quietly to those who've developed eyes to see and ears to hear the subtle moral dimensions of ordinary interaction. This capacity for moral perception develops like any other skill, through practice, through attention, through cultivating what we might call ethical sensitivity. It's the difference between walking through the world focused primarily on our own concerns and moving through shared spaces with genuine awareness of the other conscious beings we encounter along the way. Think about someone you know who seems naturally attuned to others' needs, who notices when someone is having a hard time, who offers help before being asked, who creates space for others to be authentically themselves. This isn't a magical gift they were born with. It's a capacity they've developed through years of paying attention, through making the choice again and again to see others clearly, to care about their experience, to respond with whatever kindness or support seems most appropriate. Such individuals often report that the world feels more vivid to them, more alive with possibility and meaning. When you're genuinely present to the people around you, when you're attentive to the subtle ways they communicate their needs and joys and struggles, daily life becomes richer, more textured, more full of opportunities for connection and contribution. But this heightened awareness also brings increased responsibility. Once you begin to see clearly, it becomes harder to walk past suffering that could be alleviated, harder to ignore opportunities to be helpful, harder to maintain the comfortable boundaries that protect us from feeling too much about others' difficulties. This is why some people unconsciously choose a kind of moral myopia, limiting their attention to a narrow circle of concern where the demands feel manageable. It's an understandable response to the overwhelming nature of need in the world, but it also represents a kind of spiritual impoverishment, a voluntary shrinking of the self that cuts us off from much of what makes human life meaningful. The alternative isn't trying to help everyone with everything. That way lies burnout and despair. Instead, it's developing what we might call skillful compassion, the wisdom to know where and how our particular gifts can be most useful, how to respond to need without being consumed by it, how to care deeply while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for sustained ethical action. This kind of practical wisdom emerges through experience, through trial and error, through learning to calibrate our responses to match both the needs we encounter and our own capacity to help. The parent learns to distinguish between their child's genuine distress and their temporary frustration. The friend develops skill at knowing when to offer advice and when to simply listen. The community member figures out how to contribute meaningfully to local causes without sacrificing their own well-being. Each of these learnings represents a deepening of moral maturity, an increased capacity to navigate the complex territory where individual needs intersect with collective responsibility, where personal limitations must be balanced against the legitimate claims that others have on our attention and care. And this brings us to something that the trolley problem, for all its philosophical sophistication, can't quite capture. The way that most moral choices aren't made in isolation, but emerge from ongoing relationships, ongoing commitments, ongoing patterns of care that have developed over time. The parent's choice about how to respond to their teenager's request isn't just about this particular moment. It's informed by years of shared history, by understanding of this specific young person's needs and patterns, by long-term commitments to their growth and well-being that extend far beyond any single decision. The friend's choice about whether to confront someone about behavior that's causing harm isn't just about immediate outcomes. It's shaped by the depth of their relationship, by their understanding of how this person typically receives feedback, by their own credibility and standing to offer such input, by their commitment to the long-term health of the friendship. These relational contexts add layers of complexity that abstract moral reasoning struggles to address. They require not just ethical principles, but what we might call relational intelligence, the ability to read the subtle dynamics of connection, to understand how different people receive care and challenge, to navigate the delicate balance between honoring others' autonomy and taking responsibility for our impact on their lives. This relational dimension of ethics also reveals why moral development is inherently social. We don't figure out how to live well in isolation. We learn through encounter with others whose needs and perspectives challenge our assumptions, whose responses to our choices teach us about consequences we hadn't anticipated, whose own moral examples inspire us to grow in directions we might not have imagined on our own. The child learns about fairness not just from rules, but from playground dynamics where different ideas about sharing and inclusion come into contact. The young adult develops ethical reasoning through friendships that require balancing honesty with kindness, loyalty with accountability. The mature person continues this education through partnerships and parenthood and community involvement, where abstract principles must be applied in contexts that resist simple solutions. Each relationship becomes a laboratory for moral growth, a space where we can experiment with different ways of showing up, where we can observe the gap between our intentions and their reception, where we can learn from mistakes and gradually develop more skillful ways of caring for others while maintaining integrity ourselves. And perhaps this is where the deepest wisdom of the trolley problem lies, not in the specific choice it presents, but in its recognition that moral life requires us to act in the face of uncertainty, to choose without perfect information, to take responsibility for outcomes we can't fully predict or control. This uncertainty isn't a flaw in the system that better information or clearer principles could fix. It's a fundamental feature of moral existence, a reflection of the fact that we're finite beings trying to make choices in a complex world where our knowledge is always partial, our perspective always limited, our capacity to foresee consequences always incomplete. Living well within this uncertainty requires developing what we might call ethical courage. Not the dramatic courage of heroes in extraordinary circumstances, but the quiet, steady courage needed to keep making thoughtful choices, even when we can't be certain they're right, to keep caring about outcomes even when we can't control them, to keep trying to act with wisdom and compassion even when our previous efforts have sometimes fallen short. This kind of courage manifests in countless small ways throughout ordinary life. The willingness to apologize when we've made mistakes, even when the apology might be awkward or insufficient. The commitment to keep learning about issues that affect our community, even when the complexity feels overwhelming. The choice to extend grace to others who are struggling, even when their behavior has caused us inconvenience or pain. Each of these represents a form of moral bravery, a willingness to engage with ethical complexity rather than retreating into indifference or cynicism. They're acts of faith in the possibility that our choices matter, that consciousness can create meaning through commitment to values that transcend immediate self-interest. As the night deepens around you and your thoughts begin their gentle drift towards sleep, perhaps you can feel this courage stirring within you, not as a dramatic call to heroic action, but as a quiet readiness to meet tomorrow's moral opportunities with whatever wisdom you've gathered, whatever compassion you've cultivated, whatever commitment you've made to the ongoing work of living ethically in an uncertain world. The person standing beside those railway tracks, in all their doubt and determination, represents something beautiful about human consciousness, our capacity to recognize that our choices matter, our ability to care about consequences that extend beyond our own immediate experience, our willingness to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers but never stop being worth asking. Tomorrow will bring its own versions of this eternal dilemma, its own moments when competing values intersect, when good intentions must navigate complex realities, when the simple desire to do right meets the intricate challenge of discerning what rightness looks like in particular circumstances. You'll meet those moments with whatever preparation this quiet reflection has provided, not with certainty about what the correct choices will be, but with deeper appreciation for the weight and privilege of moral agency itself, for the recognition that consciousness comes with both the burden and the gift of responsibility for how we show up in the world. The trolley continues its philosophical journey, no longer an urgent crisis but a patient teacher, carrying within its simple scenario an invitation to engage more thoughtfully with the ethical dimensions of ordinary life, to develop greater sensitivity to the moral opportunities that surround us constantly, to approach the work of living well with the kind of humble seriousness it deserves. In the gentle quiet that follows conscious analysis, in the space where sharp reasoning softens into receptive contemplation, you carry this recognition into rest. You are a moral agent in the world, embedded in relationships that shape and are shaped by your choices, participating in the ancient human project of learning to create goodness through the patient accumulation of thoughtful decisions made with as much wisdom and care as consciousness can muster. The lever waits in the space between reflection and dreams, between the complexity of ethical reasoning and the simplicity of sleep. It reminds us that moral life isn't a problem to be solved, but a capacity to be cultivated, not a destination to be reached, but a way of traveling through the world with greater attention to how our presence affects the quality of shared existence. And in that recognition, as consciousness fades and the questions settle into that deep place where understanding grows through contemplation rather than analysis, there's something profoundly peaceful. Not the peace of having found easy answers, but the deeper peace that comes from engaging meaningfully with difficult questions, from recognizing our own agency in shaping the world through countless small choices, from participating in the endless, beautiful, complex work of trying to live well together. The trolley's whistle grows soft now, but the questions it carries remain, woven into the fabric of rest, settled into that quiet place where wisdom develops, not through argument but through patient attention to what it means to be conscious, to choose, to care about more than ourselves in a world that offers infinite opportunities for moral growth and contribution to the slow work of making existence a little more thoughtful, a little more compassionate, a little more worthy of the remarkable gift of awareness itself. And so, dear friend, as the final echoes of that philosophical trolley fade into the gentle darkness of your room, we find ourselves at the end of our quiet journey together. We began with a simple question: would you pull the lever? And discovered that beneath its surface lies an entire universe of moral complexity, human wisdom, and the beautiful difficulty of trying to live well in an uncertain world. Tonight, you've explored not just a famous thought experiment, but the very nature of ethical reasoning itself. You've considered how our moral intuitions develop over time, how relationships shape our understanding of right and wrong, how the small daily choices we make accumulate into the substance of character. You've wrestled with questions that have no easy answers, and in that wrestling, you've participated in the ancient human practice of trying to discern what it means to choose thoughtfully in a complex world. The trolley may have been imaginary, but the moral muscles you've exercised in thinking about it are entirely real. The capacity for ethical reflection you've cultivated in these quiet minutes will serve you well as you navigate tomorrow's choices, both large and small. For in the end, we are all standing beside our own metaphorical railway tracks, hands hovering over our own metaphorical levers, trying to choose with wisdom, compassion, and humble recognition of our own limitations. As sleep gently claims you now, carry with you this recognition. You are a moral agent in the world, capable of growth and learning, embedded in relationships that both challenge and support your development. Your choices matter, your caring makes a difference, and your willingness to engage thoughtfully with difficult questions contributes to the slow, patient work of making the world a little more thoughtful, a little more compassionate, a little more worthy of the consciousness that inhabits it. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller. The trolley's journey is complete, but yours continues with each new dawn and every choice that follows. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice the gentle art of living ethically in a beautiful, complex, endlessly surprising world.